morning, good afternoon, or whenever you're watching this video. Today we are talking about the American Revolution. So, how did America become America? You should have your notes 3A from the file folder over by the door. Make sure your first and last name and your period is on your paper. So remember, we talked about the Enlightenment where we are learning about different ways to do art, but also different ways to govern, different ways to change the world. So these Enlightenment ideas would overthrow the most powerful nation on earth and create its own. Today's learning target, I will be able to describe the causes of the American Revolution and the origins of the New Republic. And by New Republic, I mean America. Your exit ticket is going to ask you what caused the American Revolution. So at some time in class, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, and you should be able to give me at least one cause of the American Revolution. When George III became king of Great Britain, his North American colonies were growing quickly, meaning he had, even though they lived in Great Britain, they had other countries that they owned and operated and collected money from. Economically, the colonies thrived on trade with nations of Europe. But by the mid 1700s, colonists had been living in America for nearly 150 years, and people were used to a great level of independence. Colonists saw themselves as less as British, but more as Virginians or Pennsylvanians. However, they were still British subjects and were expected to follow British law. In 1754, war erupted, and no, we're not talking about the American Revolution. We're talking about the French and Indian War. The French had colonized parts of North America, and the conflict was known as the French and Indian War. In Europe, however, they called it the 7 Years' War because the fighting lasted until 1763, when Britain and her colonists emerged victorious and they gained all of French land in North America. The victory led to problems, though. In order to fight the war, Great Britain ran up a huge amount of debt because American colonists benefited from their victory to pay for that debt. Great Britain began passing taxes on colonists to help pay for the war. The colonists, of course, got angry and then argued no taxation without representation. Alrighty, if you flip to page 7 and ask you just that question, what does no taxation without representation meaning if I'm going to be taxed, what does it mean to say I need representation before that happens? Alrighty, so once again, with the American Revolution, we have some precursors to the American Revolution. So the first one is the Stamp Act. So anything that was printed on paper had to be stamped. In order to get this stamp, you had to pay a tax. And so colonists began to rebel against this. They started boycotting British goods. They started attacking stamp agents or the people who had to stamp these documents. They said that this was a violation of their natural rights because the tax went only to Great Britain. There was no benefit to the colonists. And ultimately, Great Britain repealed the Stamp Act a year later, but they passed other acts like the Declaratory Act of 1766 and 1767, which were taxes on other things. This led to what is called the Boston Massacre, where 5 colonists met with soldiers who were there to protect British goods. The colonists threw snowballs and rotten eggs, and ultimately 5 Americans were shot. What happened next is what is called the Boston Tea Party some years later, where colonists were wanting to then boycott the tax that was placed on tea, which was a drink that most Western cultures drank. And so to protest that tax, they dumped over $1 million worth of tea in the Boston Harbor, and they dubbed it the Boston Tea Party. So Great Britain's king at the time, which was George III, was infuriated, and so he began what is called the Intolerable Acts, which he required colonists to pay for and house British soldiers, and those soldiers were there to protect Great Britain's interests. And this is going to lead into, about a year or two later, what is going to be called the American Revolution. So after the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts, several colonies, which will later become states, sent representatives to what is going to be called the First Continental Congress. And so they began plotting what they should do to fix the situation. The king did not pay much attention to this. And so they had what was the Second Continental Congress, and they named George Washington as their military commander. While this is happening, this is when Great Britain starts to realize this could become a problem. And so they sent soldiers again to America, and Americans took this as a threat. And so this is where you hear about the famous Paul Revere ride, where he rides to the colonists to warn them that, hey, troops are on the way. Ultimately, the troops meet up with some 70 farmers and villagers, and we don't know who fired the first shot, but somebody did. And this is going to lead to 300 British and 100 colonists will end up dying in this skirmish. And this is essentially the start of the American Revolution, with George Washington as our commander. While that's happening, the Declaration of Independence is being drafted, and this is the beginning drafts of it. Think of it as when you're writing a love letter or a letter to somebody and you have to scratch off things, you got to change up stuff. So this was the beginning of that, which was initially written by Thomas Jefferson. So one of your questions on your notes ask you who's the principal author. Your answer should be Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence, you may not view it as being, super important, but it was literally based on the Enlightenment ideas. So you just learned about the Enlightenment. Some of the ideas that came out of that were that every individual should be entitled to certain basic rights like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that the government cannot take these rights away. And when they do, we have the right to rebel. These were all inspired by John Locke. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, meaning we, the governed, give our consent to be governed by someone else, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Meaning, when the government doesn't allow us to make decisions, we should either fix it or get rid of it.